Welcome to the latest edition of Broadcasting Today, where we have Gillian Joseph, anchor at Sky News for well over a decade and in the business for nearly a quarter of a century, and Adrian Warner, sports journalist extraordinaire, who's been to virtually every Olympics since the late 1980s. All part of our mission here at Middlesex University, London, to teach students how to think, but also how to do. Welcome to the latest edition of Broadcasting Today. Tonight we have Gillian Joseph, anchor at Sky, and sports journalist extraordinaire, Adrian Warner. So, first, Gillian, welcome.
Thank you.
I always start by asking people what on earth got them into journalism when there was a whole world before them when they left university. What got you into journalism?
Well, I was always interested in the arts in the broad sense, and I initially wanted to be a writer, and I thought that'd be fantastic. And then I thought about it very hard and realised that there would be nothing worse than sitting staring at the blank page waiting for inspiration, and that I thought would be an agonising prospect. So I thought, well, why not do something that involved writing, but I'd be presented with the story.
You moved quite quickly, didn't you, once you came into journalism, to deciding that you wanted to be not just a reporter, because I remember you when we were both young.
Thank you.
Trusting reporters. And then you decided quite quickly you wanted to become an anchor. What tipped you in that direction?
It wasn't really a decision. I mean, it was something that was foisted upon me. I mean, not that I didn't welcome it, but it was suggested that maybe I should try and anchor some programmes and do a show reel, which I did. And then I kind of moved down that avenue. But I did really miss the reporting, as I started in radio. And in those days, it's a very long time, nobody will know what this is, but we used to go out with a ewer. Does anybody know what a ewer is? So they do, some nods. And your ewer, your microphone, and that was it. And you went out and you had, you know, complete independence, and you could craft your story, and then you'd actually come back and put the tape on those splicing decks and cut the tape and edit. And then, what did you call the marking chalk? I can't remember what you called it now. And then you had yellow and white marking chalk. I mean, it's so long ago that people here will not be able to comprehend. But I went from that to eventually then, years later, being at Radio 1, where we were editing on a system called Sadie. When you look at the sound waves, you probably understand that more. But I mean, it was such a world apart from where I started. So it was nice to sort of been abreast of all the developments.
Adrian, you were a linguist to begin with, weren't you? And you could have been translating great words of people at the United Nations. But you too decided journalism was a better craft. Why?
Well, I mean, madness really. I trained as a simultaneous interpreter just because I wanted to do languages and have a practical degree. But I never really wanted to do that. One, because I wasn't very good at it. And I quickly learned the ability to mime, which was very good in debates when you didn't understand what was going on. And you'd go, and everybody would be looking around checking what's going on, and simply just wait until you started understanding again. Anyway, so and then I started speaking. Of course, everybody would jump because they'd turned all their volume up thinking they'd lost me. So I realised pretty quickly that I wasn't very good at that, but I did want to be in this. I remember in the old days, you're talking about old machinery, I had what I thought was really cool, this first computer, an Amstrad, and you could write things on this and change the names of all the editors. And change the addresses, and I thought it was fantastic. And I wrote to every newspaper in the country, from the Channel Isles to the north of Scotland, to try and get some work experience while I was at university. And quite a few of them replied, actually, and 2 or 3 of them gave me an opportunity to work for them in the holidays. And then once I'd done that, I thought, this is what I want to do. So then my degree became get what I need. And then fortunately, I got into Reuters then on their graduate trainee scheme.
I mean, they still do that graduate trainee scheme.
Yes, they do. In fact, today, there was a thing on Twitter looking for people to come in during the summer. They're obviously looking for new talent, so there's always an opportunity to go in there and work there. And it was great, you know. I mean, it was quite hard to get on, but somehow I managed to. And then it was a great scheme because they sent you off to be a foreign correspondent for a year. and then you came back, and then they decided whether they wanted to keep you after 2.5 years. It was a great start, and of course having the languages gave me that one step ahead, because they could send me to Germany and they could send me to Holland. Well, I learned Dutch pretty quickly, but because I'd got the other languages as well.
Your development, as it were, was slightly more organic, wasn't it? Because you didn't go on a training scheme. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I did. I was one of 3 to receive a national bursary from the BBC to do a postgrad in journalism, and there was one, I think, Cardiff, City, which is the one that I got, and LCP. Yeah, so there were 3 of us that were chosen, and they trained us for a year. We did the postgrad, passed, thank God, and at the end of it there was nothing. So I I called them up and said, well, where's my job? And they said, well, it actually doesn't really work like that. So I said, what's the point of training me for a year, spending all this money, and then saying goodbye at the end of it? You know, you've got to have something for me to do. And this is one of the qualities that you have to have, push at those closed doors. And they sent me up to Manchester to see Roy Sarchi, who was the head of Northwest, BBC Northwest. I thought we were going to have a chat. He gave me a news and current affairs quiz on the spot, which I wasn't expecting, and thank God, again, I passed. And he said, right, okay, so you can come up here, come up to Manchester, work in the newsroom, and that's how I got into the BBC. But they had no plans for me to do that. They just had these schemes, trained you up, and then let you go off and let somebody else take the benefit.
I don't think that changed much once you got into the BBC, though, because, I mean, his story is with the BBC very often, you still have to make your own way, don't you?
Oh, yes.
That sense of resilience, that sense of trying to find things that you might like to do.
Absolutely.
And the doors that might be closed, but you have to prise open. You still have to do that.
Oh, definitely. No, you sometimes have to kick those doors down. But the good thing about the BBC is that there were very many areas that you could work within. So although you had the one job, you could move around and do attachment. The attachment system, I think, is fantastic. So I took advantage of that a lot. So I worked on Newsnight, I worked on Breakfast TV, I worked on Radio 1, Radio 4. So that was really good.
Essentially, Adrian, you were a newspaper man, though. I mean, you spent the last 7 or 8 years in broadcast, but the previous X number of years as a paper journalist. Why did you decide to make that transition?
Well, I made one jump into newspapers after I'd been at Reuters for sort of 15 years and 10 years abroad. And then there was this opportunity that came up. And I always quite liked a little bit of broadcasting. I liked your world, really. And I thought, can I do this? And I thought, actually, I'm 40-something now, or maybe 39 or whatever I was. And I thought, wait a minute, this is the only opportunity.
You keep telling me you're younger every year, by the way.
But I thought, this is the only opportunity I'm going to get to do this. And I thought, right, let's give it a go. But I'll never forget the first day I did it. And I just remember thinking, this is a big mistake. From my point of view, coming in as a text journalist, you knew what a story was, but how you made that into good television was quite hard. And I just watched how, I didn't know how the newsroom worked in a very different way to a newspaper newsroom and an agency newsroom, and it was just getting the geography. And once I worked out the geography, that person did that, that's the person that does this, right, I understand that, and then starting to think in television terms. But you basically throw your writing skills, it really is like changing your golf swing, you know, or anything like that, you know. Suddenly you have to write differently, very differently to the way you would write a piece for a national newspaper, and that was hard.
What are the big differences between the newsrooms then, as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think in television, people do all sorts of different jobs. Like, I mean, they have a job at BBC London called intake. I mean, how do you understand what that means? But actually, it's the person who runs, where the crews are going to go, all that kind of thing. You need to know that person really well, because if you need a crew quickly, you need to have a good relationship with them, those sorts of things. Now, that doesn't happen in a newspaper newsroom. You have a news editor, yes. That was the person you went to if you had a story. You went to the news editor, and the news editor said, I like that story, maybe we'll put that on the front. And then the editor would maybe come in at the last minute at the Evening Standard, was very, very active, and she'd say, right, I want that on the front, I want an editorial about that. That sort of happens in a television newsroom, but there's a lot of other jobs. You see, producers, I mean, I was used to working on my own. I didn't need anybody to ring somebody up. That's what I did. I was a journalist, I rang people up all the time. And then to have somebody, but I appreciate that you need them in television, because you might be trying to get the information together, they're trying to get the pictures together and get the right shots and think of the right place to do the interview. And so you do have to work much more in a team. I think as a television journalist, as a newspaper journalist, you're very much you and your laptop. You've had the discussion with the news editor, and it's you then.
Does that change the output, do you think?
I found television much more interesting because you had always somebody to bounce an idea off. So if you were editing with somebody or out with your crew, and indeed talking to presenters, because I think talking to presenters was always very interesting because they came from the point of view of the viewer. So you might be really excited about a story and they'd say, Adrian, well, it's very exciting. This is more interesting. And often they were right. And so that you have to talk to more people, and it's a much more of a team game. And that was new to me. I'd spent 17 years being, I suppose, not selfish, but used to being self-sufficient, not requiring anybody else to help me produce the story.
It definitely is much more of a collaboration.
Is that what you do as an anchor, though? The story comes to you, you say, what's this rubbish you're giving me to read tonight?
Sometimes, hopefully not too often, but there's somebody constantly speaking to me in my ear. You know, there are other people having other conversations, and you stay across all of that. All of those people are absolutely vital to what then ends up on the screen, but it's all about team effort.
Is there a difference between Sky and the way other newsrooms work, would you say, between the BBC and Sky? I mean,
oh yeah,
culture, character.
Yeah, culture, just about everything you care to mention. I think that Sky is a much hungrier animal. It's a much smaller operation. We don't have the vast numbers of staff that the BBC have, and yet I think it'd be fair to say that we now have the breaking news. But I think now that we really do hold that title of being first and breaking news. So I think that's how Sky's quite different to the BBC. I mean, I think the BBC, I know in Greg Dyke's book, he accused them of analysis paralysis, and I think there is something in that. Not the BBC, I spent more than 15 years there, you know, it was my home. But I think if there is an idea at the BBC, there will be several meetings before you even get to stage one.
Do you think they're more pointy heads at the BBC?
Well, I just think they ponder more, and in that time you can lose the story. Sky, someone can come up with an idea in the morning and it could be on air. Everything changes the whole time, so it's a real steep learning curve.
What persuaded you to go to Sky? Was it that instinct was different? Was it the sense that the BBC was a bit fusty, musty, and that Sky had that kind of four-trekker kind of attitude? Yeah,
I mean, I think I'd been at the BBC at that stage for over 15 years, and I really thought if I don't leave now, I'm never going to leave. You know, I can see me drawing my pension here, and I wanted a challenge, I wanted something else, and also I wanted to see if I could cope in that commercial environment, because, you know, the BBC's not called Auntie for nothing. It was a very cosseted environment. You know, there were several people, several layers that were there to prop you up. And with Sky, it actually almost is just you. You know, the buck starts and ends with you. And I think if you can survive in that environment, there aren't very many places that you couldn't work. So for me, it was a good time to change, to challenge myself, which I think I really did.
So you've been at Sky nearly a decade now, haven't you?
It's about 8 years, yeah.
And it's a curious thing that of all the coverage that the BBC has, of all the output that it has, there's still nobody quite like Gillian Joseph who's come behind in the BBC. What do you make of that?
Isn't there? What do you mean, like Gillian Joseph?
Well, I think, you know, there are very few women of African origin who are on our screens. And you've been there for longer than virtually anybody. What is it that's stopping, you know?
I really don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I don't know if it's perhaps they think that it's an environment that they couldn't succeed in, or an environment that wouldn't perhaps let them in. There are always going to be problems. I know that, you know, there's the big R, the racism word. Racism exists in society, it exists in all organisations. But my point of view is that that's their problem. It's not mine, and I don't make it mine. And I think if you really want to get ahead, you shouldn't really sort of let anything stand in your way. I mean, I had role models when I was growing up. There was Sir Trevor MacDonald, there was Moira Stewart, and people like that made me think, well, actually, this is something that I can do. And I think there are people coming forward. Maybe we're not seeing the fruits of it just as yet, but there are very many in production coming forward. And I think in years to come, we will see that change across all broadcasters.
I mean, one of the big changes since we started is that there's been a bit of a merge in a way between print and broadcast. I mean, in the sense that now, as a broadcaster, you do have to write. It's not the same as writing copy for the Evening Standard or the Daily Mail, but you will have to write for online. And likewise, in the Evening Standard, I mean, they're launching a new station in the next week or so. So those barriers, if you like, have started to fall. Did you see that in your work, Adrian?
Well, you know, Kurt, I always had a feeling that would eventually happen, wouldn't it? That all these areas would come together. But I thought I'd be retired by the time it happened, and it's happened a lot sooner, hasn't it? And I think you'll find now newspapers that you watch, all of them are looking for audio-visual content, and that thing that we call the television isn't going to be called the television by the next generation anyway. That computer screen is going to merge with the television, and the idea of having one in your living room like you might have at home, and then just having one of them and not walking around the house and popping it in different rooms as you were going around the house, or having some sort of computer screen in every room. I think in 3 or 4 years' time, maybe even sooner than that, it's happening now.
Well, now most people don't view the news at an appointed time and sit down in front of a television. You know, they're on iPads, whatever devices they've got, on the go on their phones. And it's more about accessing the news as you want, when you want, and even now deciding which stories are your top stories and almost creating your own running order. Do you think the sorry to ask a question.
Yeah, no, that's my job to ask a question.
But do you think the 10 o'clock news and things like that, I mean, not and Sky or wherever it is, do you think that that's going to last for very long, where you have that moment in the day where some people, large numbers, watch one programme, or is that going to go? No, I think that will eventually go. I think people will choose when they access their news, how they access it. We probably will still have remnants of the 10 o'clock news and the 9 o'clock news, but the majority of viewers, I don't think, will be accessing their news like that. And I think it's not going to be that long.
Now, one of my bugbears is that actually when you look across the narratives that are explored by television news, they haven't really changed that much in the 30 years or so I've been associated with news. It's still very difficult to get alternative stories on the news, whether it be on Sky, whether it be on the BBC or ITV. Still, there are whole sections of our community that really don't get much exposure on airtime. And it's partly a reflection of the people who are presenting the stories, and it seems to be a particular problem in broadcasting. Do you think that's true over at Sky as it is, as I see it, at BBC? I think it's changing, being aided by technology, because we certainly encourage people to make it an interactive process and to get in touch with stories. We often ask people to film their clips during the floods. We ran very many clips of people who'd filmed what had been happening in their backyard, asked for their opinion. Twitter, we're all over Twitter. I mean, I actually probably wouldn't be on Twitter personally, but for the job, it's essential. So I think it is much more interactive, and I think we're accessing communities and people who previously wouldn't get their views on the television at all. Adrian, I mean, it's not an alternative narrative, but sports journalism has always been slightly at either on the back pages. You've tried to make it a serious part of the journalistic enterprise, haven't you? By not just talking about sport, Man United beating or losing to Liverpool this weekend, obviously, but also the business of sport and the Olympics itself. You know, the infrastructure and all the other stories that come out of it. You've really worked hard to make sure that gets mainstream. Well, you see, I mean, my view was I was an Olympics correspondent for 7 years, and I probably in that time talked to a handful of athletes. You know, it isn't a sports story, the Olympics. It's about politics, it's about construction, it's about budgets, it's a financial story, who's paying for it. And at the end, it's a bit of a sports story. Agree, I'm not
saying, or I'm not saying anything against the athletes in that way. Of course, they're the stars of the show, but they've got to build the theatre first. And the arguments about how they're going to build the theatre, how much they're going to pay for it, are very much the story there. And my view was, when I started in Fleet Street in 1986, sport was on the sports pages, and there were loads of people who never read about Manchester United. And then we saw all these clubs being taken over, some of them going public. It became a business story. And then, of course, now, with all the issues that go on, whether it's racism, anti-gay, some people with anti-gay views on the terraces, it's become a social story. So I always, when I talk to students or whatever, I say, look, I don't care if you hate sport. You're going to have to deal with it. And it goes back, and that goes back to my days as a foreign correspondent, where as a foreign correspondent, you had to cover sport. And because it took me into politics, you know, when I went to Germany in '88, posted there, but on an aside on that, I'll never forget turning up in 1988 in Bonn, and one of the correspondents, who's now a very senior editor in Fleet Street, said to me, I don't know why you've come to Germany, nothing happens here. Of course, within 9 months, the Berlin Wall had fallen. We got the biggest story in Europe for decades and decades. But it was going into East Germany and talking to doctors who'd led this systematic doping of East German athletes that really got me interested in sport, and seeing East Germany that used sport to give it an international global brand, if you like, of 15 million people, or less than 15 million people, that could win gold medals after gold medals. We know how they did it because of systematic doping, a lot of them. But it showed me that this isn't just about games. This is a big political issue. And then when I started covering the Olympics, I realised that getting the Olympics was more about politics than anything, for London as well.
If we look at the infrastructure that we worked with in broadcasting over the last 10 years or so, and there's been massive changes, haven't there, in that, you know, there's been reduction in staff, there's been changing technology, there's been the platforms changed. Can you see that changing in the next 10 years, next 15 years, as much as it's changed, or do you think we might be getting to a point where we might settle for a little while? I mean, because if you're a student, you're kind of trying to think ahead. Where am I going to focus my fire? Do you think that things are really so radically different, what we're talking about now will be irrelevant in 10 years' time? I would ask Gillian first.
Well, I just think that journalists are going to be required to give more and more of themselves. You know, you are going to have to be able to film your piece, edit it, do everything, basically. I think
not anchor at the same time, though.
Everything at the same time. You're going to have to multitask to the height of it. But I think now you can't really say that, you know, you are a presenter or you a reporter or, you know, you're a print journalist. I think it is just one big melting pot, and you have to have a variety of skills, and you have to keep updating those skills as well, so that you're at the cutting edge. So not that you ever could, but you certainly now can't rest on your laurels at all.
Adrian, I mean, you've come in, haven't you, in 7 years, and even the 7 years you've been at the BBC, you've seen massive transformation.
Yes, I agree totally with Gillian in terms of the skills. I mean, you've got to be able to film, edit, and do everything, and present. I mean, one forgets that, I don't know whether you have it at Sky, but the presenter, the autocue has a little foot pedal. You know, don't assume that somebody else is running it through all the time. And I think there's going to be more and more of that. My only worry, though, Kurt, is as an old hack, because I'm a hack, really. I've come into your television world for a few years, but I'm a hack, really. And my worry is that if you're feeding the beast all the time, so many doing lives, doing filming, editing, all these things, you actually might miss the story. Because the times I've got stories is when you've had that aside, that little aside while the cameraman or camera woman is setting up the shot. You can't do that if you're setting up the shot. And those little asides are sometimes not necessarily the story for this time, but there's something that gets you thinking, oh, that's interesting. That's a story for next time. Because I always believe when you go out on a story, there's always a story for next time. because you're talking to people and you're interacting with people and they'll tell you something. And my worry is that if you have everybody doing the same job all the time, doing so many jobs, they're actually going to produce sort of quite good telly, but they're not going to get any stories. And I think that's important.
What, losing the art of the scoop because
Yes.
they haven't got the time to reflect. Yeah.
And in this world, as you know, as Gillian says, you know, people go to Sky News. I mean, somebody who's worked at the BBC, I'd argue with you over that. But I actually think the places people go now for their news is their mobile phones. Twitter,
To what Sky?
Twitter. I think. Well, sometimes it's Sky News, but you know, that's where the news breaks now. I really think that. But I do think there is a challenge there, that people have got to think, how are we going to get these stories? And I don't want to see investigative journalism stop because there isn't enough money for it.
Now, you raised the issue of being an old hack, so I've got to ask you the question, because there are some white men of a certain age who think that they're like yesterday's Sting, that, you know, there's a certain point that those broadcasters, they're being overtaken by women, they're being taken over by minorities, and they're being overtaken by young people. There's no future for them. But there is there not a danger that you talk about how you create the craft, retain the craft, pass on the skills that you've got and the instinct for story? Mm-hmm. But do you think we're too youth oriented in broadcasting?
Wow. That's a hard question, isn't it?
But you need the experience.
Yeah.
And I think you can't forsake that in preference for youth. But it is youth driven. I mean, obviously there are issues with women as well, and women tend not to age on television. We're not allowed to see them age on television.
You haven't aged at all, Gillian.
Oh,
but that's changing. You don't think that's changing?
A change has been forced. But I still think, you can count on your hand middle-aged women broadcasting at the height of their career on television, and their male equivalents are everywhere.
It's very different in America, though.
It is, actually.
Which suggests there's a cultural issue. That's not to say young people aren't important in the industry. Of course they are, because they bring new ideas, fresh energy. But actually, new ideas and fresh energy still needs to be interpreted and shaped. And the Americans tend to use much older people, don't they, as broadcasters? And I wonder whether that's a cultural problem that we, as in the broadcast environment, need to wrestle with.
The best newsrooms I've ever worked in have got a mixture. They're not middle-aged men altogether, or they're a mixture of men, women, young people, because they bring in all the different views. That's what matters, because when you're sitting in a newsroom and a subject's come up, it might be prices of houses or whatever, the person who's 48 might take a very different view about house prices to the person who's desperately trying to get down the housing ladder at 2021. You need them in the room. And the same thing with issues that men and women, I mean, if one can generalise like that, will look at things in a very different way. So I think if you go too young or you go too old, you don't achieve what you need. What you need is a really good mix. And we do, in my personal opinion, we do actually, I think we should be extra careful and making sure more women are doing those jobs as they get older. I do think it has been a problem, and I think there's a certain amount of positive discrimination required, to make sure that happens. Because I do think there's a certain amount of photogenic journalism, if you like, that goes on, and we see people doing things simply because they look a little bit nicer. But I don't think the public get that.
Come on, Adrian, we've lasted.
Well, I know, but I think we're the exception, aren't we, rather than the rule? But
I'm going to throw some over to questions. I know there's some budding sports journalists here who've probably got some questions for you, but who's going to go first? Let's wait for the mic to get into you as well, if you put your hand up, and we'll get the mic into you to hear your question. Over here.
As an aspiring sports journalist, what advice would you give to someone hoping to make it in a competitive industry?
I remember I used to like going to cover rugby, and I'd volunteer for every rugby match that I knew the rugby correspondent wouldn't want to go to. Up in Scotland, long way away. He always used to like going to Dublin for some reason, not sure why. But try and cover some of the football matches and get a good broad experience of sport. But I do think you have to. The one thing I think was very interesting what you were saying there nobody will take you by the hand in this industry and lead you where you need to go. You have to take the person that can help you by the hand and say, look, I can do that. Could I have a go at doing that maybe? You know, you don't have to elbow people out of the way. Just help. Say, yeah, why don't you have a go? And so what I would advise you to do is get out, do as much reporting as you possibly can. All sorts of different matches. Doesn't matter which level it is. Get used to it. So because there are sort of different things about covering sport. You're in a very noisy environment. I'll never forget having to write when I was at Reuters. The 1994 World Cup final was in America, and Brazil won in what was probably one of the worst World Cup finals ever, because it went to penalties. And the problem, of course, with penalties is you can't write the story in advance. Most matches you can. If somebody's winning 2-0, you can write it in advance. And I'll never forget, everybody stood up. Everybody. And I was just sitting there on my laptop, and it was those sort of a little machine called a Tandy that sometimes used to actually literally caught fire during one of the World Cups and had to get the story out. And that was a great concentration in shutting out everybody else and focusing on what I did. And that did help me in television, actually, because I mean, I don't know how she does this, because I've sat with Talkback in the studio and had all these people talking at me. And if I'm going on as a pundit, I try and avoid it. Because because it puts you off. You know, you're trying to make an important point.
Now. I've actually been known to go home with my earpiece in. I'm just used to the voices all the time.
That's a bit worrying.
I mean, it's an interesting question, actually, because, of course, when we started, there were very few outlets. If we wanted, and we had the desire and the passion to write, in fact, we had this conversation the other day, didn't we, with one of the students over here, that actually, if you're going to blog, you've got ways of sharing your passion with other people. So if you're interested in football or basketball, there are places where you can write about it and create that energy yourself, which we didn't have, of course, when we were starting out.
No, and I think that's crucial. If I was looking at somebody, if you were sitting in front of me and asking me to employ you, I'd want to see all that. I think when we were doing that, you had cuttings. So you tried to get as many cuttings from any sorts of newspapers you possibly could. But if you came to me as a sports journalist and wanted to work for me, and you hadn't got a blog, you hadn't got a Twitter account, you weren't getting your views out somewhere in this world, I'm afraid I wouldn't give you a job. I'd want to see, what do you write? Oh, that's quite good, isn't it? What else have you done? That's what I'd want to see.
Anybody else? Yes? Just wait for the mic to come into you, which this one on here is going to come in.
Do you work with a lot of female sports journalists at the BBC? Because that's something I really want to go into, but I'm always worried as a female that you're going to get told, sport's very much a men's thing and sort of stay out of it. Well, certain sports more than others anyway.
I think there's a big push at the moment at the BBC to get more women covering. I mean, if you look at presenters, there's a lot of female presenters working at BBC Sport now. They've just.
And Jackie Oakley started doing.
Yes.
When she started.
I think that's a breakthrough. I want to see that. I want to see the first female rugby commentator. A sport that is regarded, although women play it a lot, regarded very male-dominated. I want to see a woman doing that. And I don't think we're actually that far away from that. No, don't, quite the opposite, don't be, because I think this isn't like, in the United States, obviously, there's this culture of going into the locker room after the game. And that for a while, and in Australia, at Rugby League, that was quite hard for some of the really good female journalists to get beyond that barrier. That doesn't exist in this country. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And there's no reason why you should have less analysis than me of a football game. I don't believe in this idea that everybody has to have played a sport to the highest level to have that analysis. We haven't, but we can work out why Arsenal won.
Isn't it the case also, though, that with women's sport being more, not acceptable is the wrong word, but being of greater interest. I mean, women's rugby, they run the Six Nations more or less back to back now with the men's rugby. And actually that in some ways gives women a great opportunity to be covering that sport, because most men won't go and do it. And actually it's just as exciting to go and watch it. I have a niece who plays for Tottenham Ladies. Fantastic football. And if there's anybody there to cover it, so actually from a student point of view, it's a great opportunity to create your own blog and your own voice in a world where nobody else is really looking at it.
Women's cricket, they did much better than the men, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, everyone loves a winner. Everyone loves a winner.
I've always been interested in like breaking news and live breaking news. So what processes do you have to go through when you're live on TV and get key pieces of information?
Well, first of all, you swallow very hard and calm yourself, because it is, I mean, the adrenaline is absolutely pumping. And when breaking news comes in, people are under the misapprehension that we actually have it all in front of us. Sometimes it literally is what you have in your head. And a producer will say, as they did to me one night when Anita Roddick died and I was on a late shift. And the producer said, first of all, they didn't tell me what the story was, but I just heard, because I keep an open talk back, which means I hear everything that goes on in the gallery, even the things that don't concern me. And I heard the producer saying, breaking news, we're going to the breaking news next. And I was obviously presenting, so in a story thinking, fine, but what is it? And then I just heard them get even more excited. Right, we're going to the breaking news now. Thankfully for me, we had a level-headed director who turned to the producer and said, have you told Gillian what the breaking news is? Went, oh, yes, Anita Roddick's died. So then I'm thinking, Anita Roddick, what do I know? Body shop, fair trade. Just really trying to get your thoughts together while still presenting, because, you can't stop and you can't be seen to be thinking. So those are the moments where I think presenters, anchors, definitely earn their money because there is nothing. It literally is, Anita Roddick is dead. And then you start getting interviews, people that worked with her, you start interviewing them live on air, all the while trying to get information from Reuters or just some more information in. So it really is completely seat of the pants stuff. So whenever you see breaking news, somebody is having a minor coronary, because there is a lot going on. And the story develops and, you just keep going. And sometimes with Sky, you can be on the same topic for 3 hours, rolling. And that is very, very, very difficult to sustain.
But admit, it's really good fun.
It is, because you do get carried away with adrenaline. It is a rush. But when it's over, you are completely drained. And if it goes past 3 hours, you're thinking, God, when's the next person coming on? But those are the moments I suppose you do it for. And it is exciting. But as much as it is thrilling, it is terrifying as well. It can be.
But you see, Kurt, the key thing there, I think, as a student is to, and I'm sure you agree with this is where all that reading you've done, the reading of the papers every day, the taking in of all this information. If you're a correspondent, you might broadcast, I reckon, about 10% of what you know. But the rest is all in there. Those little briefings you've gone to, all that background is there. And it's there for those moments when suddenly they say, we want you on for another 4 or 5 minutes, something's happened, we're going to our correspondent in the field, and you can talk then for a long time because you know your stuff. And I think that's where the real skill of the great presenter like you can do that, because you've got all this knowledge. You may have read that in the paper and that gives you a question. And you're not thinking, oh, I need all this information. You remember this happened maybe 10 years ago. And that's very important, isn't it?
But it's calling on it under pressure. That's the key.
I'll take one more question actually, and then any other questions we can have afterwards with some nibbles and some drinks.
You mentioned that you could speak another language. How important is it to know another language in journalism, or does it depend on which language you can speak?
I would say it's important. The reason I found it, I mean, I speak French and German, which are traditional, European language. It'd be much more useful. I could speak Portuguese and Mandarin, but the one thing I found as a journalist is I could then go into all sorts of different places and speak those languages, and people immediately had respect. Firstly, because they thought, hang on, that's a Brit speaking German. That doesn't happen, does it? And that put you ahead. So if you've got another language, you can use it. But I like it because it allows me to read other media areas and take a different view than just the Anglo-centric view, which I personally think is quite important.
But of course, it's also true to say that if you have another language and you are young getting into the industry, it's a point of access potentially. If you speak Arabic or, you know, Hindi or Bengali or Portuguese, whatever other language it might be, it gives you a particular access point to communities which others can't get, which you can ruthlessly exploit in order to get your own point of access. Is that not the case? I mean, whether it's German or French or any other language.
Well, look, Kurt, I mean, my first serious job when I was posted to become a sports correspondent in Germany, I was like about 24. I wasn't good enough for this job. I really wasn't. I hadn't got enough sports experience. I'd never been to an Olympic Games. But the German got me through the door, and then I learned quickly. But because I could speak German, they thought, right, well, we better send him. And quite frankly, they hadn't got anybody else. And I was the only person. But it was my free open door, if you like, to getting into that. And then I grabbed it with both hands. So yes, it's true. It certainly helped me. And you might say, well, you don't have to speak German. Let me tell you, if you work in Germany, you need to speak German. You know, you have a chancellor who usually converses only in her native tongue. You need to speak the language. And if you want to get the interviews, you've got to speak the language. On that note, I want to thank you both for coming along and sharing your experiences and your expertise. It's been great to have you here. Thanks very much.